Within Shattered Legacies, there is the Siritan Empire. And within the Siritan Empire itself, there are three organizations that reign supreme above all others. All three of these factions exist within the military, and these three factions are known as the three right hands of the Supreme Commander. Each one is designed for a different purpose, each one having become truly legendary within the eyes of the public of the Siritan Empire, and even within factions that aren't the Empire. These three factions are known as the Black Banshees Terror Unit, the Red Wraith Black Ops, and the Siritan Calamities. Now, in the last episode, we went over some of the most powerful warriors in the Siritan Empire. Well, after having done the video, I realized that I truly didn't give the Siritan Calamities the recognition that they deserved. So as a result, in today's episode, we're going to be continuing to cover the Siritan Calamities as well as one of the Calamities in specific in their own deep dive. Grab a drink, grab some food, get comfortable. This one is actually going to be a long episode. There is a lot to cover. So, one of the things that we need to realize, and something that I touched on in the last episode, is the fact that Calamities possess immortality. This form of immortality is rather interesting. When we covered the gods, we covered the three different types of immortality. Flawed, otherwise known as, biological immortality, flawed, otherwise known as incomplete immortality, and then finally complete immortality. Biological immortality is exactly as it sounds. You aren't capable of aging, and you're immune to disease and plagues and poisons. However, you can still very much be killed. Next up is incomplete immortality. This is a type of immortality reserved solely for the gods. If you are a greater god, an enemy of yours has to be a greater god or higher than you in order to be able to kill you, whereas somebody who is lesser, such as a mortal or lesser god, while certainly capable of damaging you, aren't capable of killing you, regardless of whether that be directly or indirectly. Finally, we possess complete immortality, this being the fact that the body becomes completely and utterly invincible, incapable of taking damage, with a few rare exceptions. The Siritan Calamities possess a pseudo-biological incomplete immortality. They're capable of being killed by anybody. However, they are... what's a good way to describe it? They're capable of being killed by anybody that they engaged with. However, they're capable of passing down this immortality. Now, this is something that is very unique, and this is why I said that it's pseudo-incomplete immortality, as gods are capable of passing on their immortality to other beings. However, this is usually solely reserved for when the god needs to transfer their soul into another being. The Siritan Calamities have biological immortality. They'll never die of old age, nor from disease, plague, or pestilence, let alone poisons. They can still be killed, however, but being able to actually kill one of these titanic, godlike individuals is practically impossible. As I've said, they're capable of passing down this immortality to anybody that they deem worthy. As a result, there are a number of different individuals who possess this form of immortality. These individuals being some members of the Siritan Natural Disasters, most significantly Siritan Calamity candidates, and anybody who becomes a Siritan Calamity proper. Now, I didn't truly explain how powerful a calamity is. I had said that a calamity candidate was capable of wiping out an entire galaxy's population on their own, with no assistance. To truly put this into perspective, we need to look at the scale of gods, otherwise known as the astral scale. Obviously, there are mortals. We're well aware of what a mortal is capable of, but there are some exceptionally powerful mortals, such as the natural disasters. Beyond that, you have demigods. Demigods possess a form of divinity, but aren't true gods. They're still mostly mortal. After that, you have lesser gods. Now, lesser gods is when we start actually getting to the point where we can quantifiably understand just how powerful they are. A lesser god would likely be capable of destroying something like a major metropolitan area or even maybe a mega city. However, you need to remember that this is just a lesser god. This is the weakest of them all. After that, you have greater gods. Destroying something like a mega city, which we've never truly talked about. A mega city is usually a city that is the size of a continent. Destroying something like a mega city is a fairly small feat for a greater god. In fact, I would say that they could easily destroy an entire planet should they deem it necessary. Beyond that, you have the lesser and greater Onin. Lesser Onin are capable of destroying entire solar systems. And keep in mind, when I say this, I'm talking about their total destructive capability, not what they can do within a single ability. As in, this is the amount of damage that they could do before they finally start running out of gas. A greater Onin, on the other hand, could probably take out multiple galaxies. The sheer gulf between a lesser and greater Onin is incredible. Beyond that, you have Omnis. Omnis, as we've stated before, are in charge of entire universes, and as a result, they typically have the power to destroy an entire universe should that be necessary. After that, you have deities. Deities are capable of destroying entire multiverses, something that is unthinkable to any other form of being. Finally, you have the big head honchos themselves, the supreme gods. Supreme gods are capable of destroying the entirety of the realm of creation, essentially the region of reality that everything exists within. There is nothing beyond the realm, but everything is contained within the realm. The realm itself, equally, is also infinite. A supreme god is not only an individual who possesses something that is considered to be an essential aspect of reality, such as creation, destruction, magic, time, those types of things, but they're also individuals who possess such incredible power that they're capable of just outright obliterating the entirety of the realm of creation should it be deemed necessary. Now, normally, these types of situations never occur. To truly put this on a quantifiable level, however, we need to compare natural disasters, calamity candidates, and calamities to these various different gods. First off, you have natural disasters. Natural disasters are roughly equivalent to a lesser Onin. They are, no, maybe not that high, probably closer to a greater god. They're capable of easily destroying entire mega cities should it be necessary, but this is usually the upper limits of their capabilities. Compare that to a calamity candidate, which is nearly on par with an Omni. Whilst it would be incredibly difficult for them to be able to take out an entire universe, given proper motivation and essentially an unlimited amount of mana, they could theoretically destroy an entire universe. Compare them to proper calamities, which are said to be equivalent to the supreme gods themselves, the highest pantheon of gods. For a calamity, destroying the realm of creation, whilst, again, an incredibly difficult feat, isn't necessarily an impossibility. They are capable of doing it. However, as you can imagine, this would cause a number of different problems. And this is where we start getting into high-ranking gods and a unique effect that they have on reality. Gods are constantly suppressing their power, their energy, whatever it may be, whether it be divine energy or magic or physical capabilities. They constantly suppress it because the more that they let themselves go, the more they're at their maximum power, the more unstable reality becomes. For something like an Omni or a deity, reality starts to fray at the edges, whereas something like a supreme god, reality quite literally starts to rip itself apart. It's like a water balloon. A normal person wouldn't even be a single drop of water within said balloon. Compare that to something like an Omni. That balloon is close to bursting, but it's still intact. It's still remaining whole. Compare that to something like a supreme god. All of a sudden, there's a single rupture point, and the entire balloon just unpeels, unleashing all of the water, that water being the supreme god's power. As a result, they constantly suppress their energies. This is why high-powered gods or high-ranking gods have access to an ability known as My Universe. It allows them to create a temporary pocket dimension that they will drag their enemies into. Within this pocket dimension, they are quite literally God. They can set the parameters to how much this pocket dimension is capable of withstanding, thus allowing for all gods to fight at their absolute limit without fear of destroying the entirety of reality. When these tears in reality occur, this is when events such as null invasions occur, when the null void bleeds into mainstream reality. Kind of like how in Warhammer 40k the warp is bleeding into the Milky Way galaxy. It's a similar concept. The only problem is that even gods don't fully understand what the null void is, and as a result, they have no way of closing it. So any situation in which the null void may be involved, the null void may bleed into reality, is considered to be not allowed. Whatever you are doing that has the possibility of causing that type of situation, you're just not allowed to do it. And gods will go to extraordinary lengths to ensure that such a situation doesn't occur. As, again, there is no way to fix it. Not even the highest pantheon of gods are capable of fixing this. Compare this to Calamities. Calamities are incredibly powerful, but for them, their balloon is far smaller. They don't have the luxury of having an immortal body of a god. As a result, they need to find other ways to suppress themselves. Intro, a concept known as power bracelets. If I ever make art of a Calamity, you'll notice that there are metal rings all across their arms. And these rings are the power bracelets themselves. And what they do is they absorb vast amounts of magic, physical strength, psionic capability, whatever it is that the Calamity is using. It absorbs astonishing amounts of power and then bleeds it off into the space around them in an undetectable manner. This allows a Calamity to regulate their power and not quite literally nuke all of reality simply by existing. And it should be noted that Calamities aren't the only ones who have this. The natural disasters as well as the Calamity candidates all have their own power bracelets. For even the most powerful of your standard natural disasters, they'll be lucky if they have a single power bracelet. Now, the power bracelet used by natural disasters is vastly inferior to that of, say, the Calamities or even the Calamity candidates. That being said, it still provides a decent power boost when they remove it. Now, because natural disasters, while still being incredibly powerful, are nevertheless significantly weaker, they don't require permission to remove their power bracelets. Oftentimes, if it's a situation that a natural disaster thinks that they need a boost in their magic via removing their singular power bracelet, odds are they're justified. And as a result, they can simply just deactivate the bracelet, take it off, and gain a massive power boost, i.e. gain access to all of their power, rather than simply maybe 50%. Compare this to something like a Calamity candidate, on the other hand, whose power bracelets are significantly more powerful. Even the most powerful of all of the Calamity candidates, this being Isaiah Tempera, only possesses 2 power bracelets. And again, just like with the natural disasters to the Calamity candidates, the power bracelets of a Calamity candidate are vastly inferior to that of a Calamity proper. For newly how do I want to put it? When a Calamity candidate is just recently brought into the fold, especially if there's somebody who isn't super powerful, oftentimes it's up to the discretion of the Calamity candidate on whether or not they should have their power bracelet removed, at which point they will tell their commanding officer, I am removing my power bracelet, before taking it off. For higher ranking ones, such as Isaiah or even April, they require permission sometimes. Certain situations, it's just, alright, if you feel like you need to remove it, remove them. Whereas other situations, they'll look at it objectively and decide, do these individuals actually require the removal of power bracelets? And the majority of the time, it is. Now, this is less prominent with Isaiah. Isaiah is not only the Winter General, he is also the Siritan Empire's primary tactician. And as a result, when Isaiah says that he requires the removal of a power bracelet, there is no arguing. There is no, hang on, I need to ask my superior if you are allowed to have your power bracelet removed. No, it is, I am removing my power bracelet right now, and if you do not agree with it, we can deal with it after the fact. But for right now, I need this power. And this is due to the fact that Isaiah has been around for so damn long. He's been around nearly as long as Duran, and Duran and Isaiah are characters back from the original natural disasters before they were rebranded as the Calamities. In fact, they're the only two that remain, aside from Molly Jackson herself, who is now the Siritan Empress. Now, we get to the Calamities proper, and we're going to start off with the weakest Calamities. Now, there is no proper, this Calamity is weaker than the other, because nobody truly knows which is stronger. These individuals are the Scarlet Devil Faust and the Crimson Samurai Benimaru. It is unanimously agreed upon that these two Calamities are the weakest of all the Calamities. Now keep in mind, they're still on the level of supreme gods. They're still individuals who could, given proper motivation, wipe out a significant portion of the realm of creation. Luckily, that type of situation almost never happens, but regardless, they are considered to be the weakest of the Siritan Calamities, and the reason that I say that you can't really say one is weaker than the other is due to the fact that both of them have completely different ways in which they use their magic. Now, what I'm about to say is going to sound like, okay, this is cut and dry. Faust has 2 power bracelets, whereas Benimaru has 4. That sounds pretty cut and dry. Faust is obviously weaker, except for the fact that every single Calamity, compared to the natural disasters and Calamity candidates, they're largely the same. They're vastly inferior to the Calamities' power bracelets, but they're largely the same. They absorb the same amount of energy. When it comes to the Calamities, their power bracelets are custom made because of the amount of power that we're dealing with at this point. So as a result, Benimaru's power bracelets absorb different amounts of magic and physical strength compared to what Faust's uses. When it comes to magic, one constant is control. You have to have control over your magic. You have to have discipline. That isn't the case with Faust, and this is one of the reasons why when we get to him, within his lore, he was always having problems with his magic. He could never attain the level of magic that a Calamity is supposed to have. When he was first brought into the fold as a Calamity, he didn't have power bracelets. He qualified for being a Calamity, but just barely. And the reasoning for this is because everybody was applying the same rules and guidelines that everybody else abide by. You need to have control of your magic. You can't let it run wild. Well, it turns out that Faust's magic does that exact same thing. It is required to cut loose, to loosen your limits, to literally let the magic run wild and rampant and uncontrolled. This is what allows Faust to become even more powerful. So as a result, Benimaru's power bracelets are absorbing magic in a completely different fashion in a completely different fashion and function compared to Faust's. So as a result, although Faust may only have 2 power bracelets and Benimaru may have 4, that doesn't necessarily mean that Faust is weaker. That being said, they are still significantly weaker than the rest of them. Now, we're going to compare that to the rest of the Ciritan Calamities. If I can find the damn notepad. There it is. So obviously, as I just said, we have Faust and Benimaru as the weakest. After that, we have Alex Jackson, the Imperial Prince. Now, it should be noted that Alex is incredibly powerful, but just like the differences between Faust's and Benimaru's power bracelets, Alex's are very different. Once again, just like Benimaru, Alex possesses 4 power bracelets. However, much like his brother Yandril, they only use raw physical prowess, as well as the power of their divine weapons when necessary. So as a result, their power bracelets aren't absorbing enormous amounts of magic. They're absorbing their physical strength, physically making them weaker, sapping them of their strength. Now, it's questioned whether or not this is necessary, as when we're talking about pure physical strength, the destruction of reality around them as a result of them simply just existing isn't a factor. However, one thing that is a factor is the fact that they have a difficult time controlling their strength. So if they don't have their power bracelets on, they could go to shake your hand and immediately grip it and just turn it into dust. And just be like, oh, shit, sorry. The power bracelets weaken them so that when they grab your hand, it's just a normal handshake rather than just basically compressing it into diamond, which sounds really cool, but also sounds horrifically painful. Next up, we have Baylor, coming in at a total of 5 power bracelets, followed by Yandril and Mikaela with 6 power bracelets. After that, we have the second strongest member of the Ciritan Calamities, this being the Astral Lord Raymond Ulcia, coming in at a whopping 7 power bracelets. And it may seem kind of goofy, you know? Okay, so I understand that each of these power bracelets is custom, but why not just increase the drain of a power bracelet? That way you don't have as many of them on you. Well, the reason then that they don't do that is due to high control. What I mean by that is, if they only have 1 power bracelet, and let's say it's absorbing 90% of their body or power, okay, so as a general rule of thumb, when a calamity possesses all of their power bracelets on their arms, they're roughly the same strength as a natural disaster. But then if a situation arises and Raymond needs more power than a natural disaster, he only has 1 power bracelet. So he removes that, and then he literally goes nuclear right off the bat at 100% power, rather than maybe going up to 10% power because he removed 1 of the power bracelets, or whatever the math would be. This is why, as a calamity becomes more and more powerful, they have more and more bracelets. Now, we get to the big boy himself, Duran Bosmer, who has a maximum of 10 power bracelets. However, one thing that should be noted is that the consumption rate of the Calamity power bracelets, whilst unique to every single Calamity, is largely relatively the same. You know, there's definitely peaks and valleys between them, but it's largely within X margin. It is absorbing X amount of power between this number and this number. And it can be anywhere between those, as each calamity is unique, but it's, again, still between X and Y. Compare that to Duran, whose power bracelets are nearly 3 to 5 times stronger than the rest of the Ciritan Calamities, The sheer gulf of power between Raymond, who's the second strongest, and Duran, who is the strongest, is unfathomable. As a matter of fact, out of all of the Siritan Calamities, there are only 4 of the 8 that have ever actually beaten a supreme god in single combat. These individuals are Alex Jackson, Michaela, Raymond Dulcia, and Duran Bosmer. Now, when we get to Alex, I'll explain why Alex's position is a bit unique. He may be, quote-unquote, the third weakest of them all, but he has abilities that easily puts him on par with Duran with a single attack. However, these attacks have very specific requirements and circumstances. So as a result, because of those, whilst I'm not giving you any information, it shouldn't be that surprising that he can go toe-to-toe with the Supreme God and maybe even win. Compare that with Michaela, who we'll get to later, who is the third strongest out of all Siritan Calamities. You can kind of see how, yeah, at that point, I would expect that these heavyweights would probably be able to hold their own. Raymond, we've talked about how he controls quite literally the concept of gravity, capable of creating ultra-high and ultra-low gravity pockets. And as a result, it should be fairly obvious how he could defeat a supreme god. However, whether that be Alex, Michaela, or Raymond, they've all beaten the same god. The same supreme god. This specific supreme god being the supreme god of destruction, Tobias. Compare that, and Tobias, whilst incredibly powerful, isn't necessarily the most powerful. Obviously, the legendary Jackson would have been the most powerful, being the supreme god of creation. Tobias would have been probably a solid third or fourth. There are 2 supreme gods, debatably, that are more powerful than him, and it's more so down to their capabilities rather than just the raw strength of their spells or physical might. These individuals are Dre, the supreme god of time, and Angel, the greater god of timelines, later to become the supreme god of the timeline. Notice specifically what I said there. The greater god of timelines and the supreme god of the timeline. There's a lot of information that happens with Angel, and as per usual, I know you guys are hating it at this point, Angel requires his own deep dive. But suffice to say, some things happened. But regardless, these 2 individuals, Dre controls the very concept of time to a lesser degree. He doesn't control absolutely everything within time, but he does control a fair chunk of it. Whereas Angel controls the timeline, or if we're talking about his greater god days, he controls all of the timelines. And we'll get to how insane that power was in the past. Suffice to say, Duran is the only individual who has beaten every single supreme god with the exception of Legend. He's never once beaten Legend in a fair fight. He's beaten Legend before, but that's largely because Legend was being a shithead and not really giving it his all and had his defenses down. Duran won that one time. But whenever Legend is fighting for real, Duran has never come close to beating him. However, he has beaten every other supreme god, which in of itself is an incredible feat. That may not sound that impressive, but in universe, considering what these supreme gods are capable of, the fact that he can defeat every single one of them is astonishing. Let's go on to our next topic, and this is how magic works when you get to really high-powered mages. When you get to a Grandmaster Mage, if I'm remembering my scale of mages correctly, when you get to Grandmaster, you unlock something known as a special type of magic, and it's specifically a special way to cast magic that is unique to your rank and has the potential of providing a massive boon. The first is known as mana imbuement. You imbue your mana throughout your entire body, becoming essentially sort of aspect of your magic, you know? When we get to the Calamities themselves, they very rarely use this, but Duran himself actually does use this. Duran has an ability known as Molten Blood, where he quite literally turns the blood in his veins into a molten state that courses through his body. How exactly he does this and doesn't die instantly is unknown. However, what is known is that this massively spikes his physical durability and physical strength to the levels of a supreme god, quite literally capable of punching somebody and turning them into a fine red mist on contact. Not just a hole that turns into a fine red mist. No, the entire person's body just vaporizes on contact. So, mana imbuement is basically, like I said, you take your magic and you weave it through your entire body, and suddenly you're stronger because you're more, quote-unquote, in touch with your magic. It's more powerful than it's ever been because now you're removing the limitations of the body and you're becoming even more powerful. This is considered to be incredibly powerful, obviously, as you can imagine, but it does come with its risks, because if you go too far, you could end up permanently altering your body. Now, that may not sound like such a bad idea. You could theoretically become an elemental. If it wasn't for the fact that the farther that you go into this process, the less of yourself remains. You start losing bits and pieces of yourselves. Suddenly, there are small pockets of memories that just don't exist anymore. You know, let's say you have a sister. All of a sudden, you know that you had a sister, but you can't quite recall what she looked like, even if you just saw her a few days ago. That's odd. And as you go farther and farther, you start noticing bigger and bigger gaps in your memory. All of a sudden, you start noticing, I have memories that I never had before, until finally it starts to blur to the point where these false memories might as well be the truth, until finally your mind starts to degrade to such an incredible level that the concept of memories and emotions no longer exist. You basically become soulless, and you become the very embodiment of an elemental, at which point you're theoretically dead. Not necessarily in a physical sense. Your body still exists, it is now an elemental, but your mind and your soul are dead. They don't exist the way that they used to. The person that you once were, even in that transformative state where your memories are being replaced, you're still technically you. You're still alive. But once you bridge that gap, go across the point of no return, suddenly, that's it. You're just gone. The body is still there. It's autonomous. It's doing whatever it's doing, but you yourself, you're just gone. Next up is when we get to the level of Magnus, and that is directly after Grandmaster Mage, I believe, if I'm remembering things correctly. This next special type of magic is known as Mana Zone, and despite the fact that Mana Imbuement sounded horrifying if you went too far with it, Mana Zone has almost no downsides. Mana Zone is very difficult to do, and it requires an incredible amount of magical control, and is one of the reasons why it is theorized that Faust will never be able to use it. It requires incredible focus and incredible control over your magic as a whole, and it's basically flooding a massive area with your magic. Now, this may sound kind of pointless until you realize that if your magic is superior to the other individual that you're fighting, and you flood the entirety of the environment around you with your own magic, suddenly, because your magic is so much denser, it's so much more powerful, it's negating all of the other magic from your enemy. Maybe not all of it, but a good portion of it. Not only this, but it allows you to essentially become like a god. Suddenly, you can jump around and you can stand literally on air, because what you're doing is you're condensing magic so tightly that it basically becomes an invisible barrier that you can physically stand on, and allowing you to literally jump around the battlefield. All of a sudden, you just stop in midair at like an impossible angle, like maybe a 120-degree angle, and just launch yourself at your opponent, because there is suddenly a physical object there, because it is you condensing the magic so tightly at that location. And it allows you to move in a way that is normally impossible for mages. Now, there are certain types of magic that do allow for movement on a similar level. There are martial artists that utilize different forms of fire magic to achieve a similar result, where they quite literally create jets of fire at specific locations along their body, and these jets of fire produce a sort of thrust, a sort of propulsion that allows them to go at incredible speeds. And by changing how that jet of fire is angled or moving, they can quite literally perform impossible movements whilst in midair, constantly creating a barrage of attacks. This is considered to be a very dumbed down version of monozone. However, individuals who have incredibly potent levels of monozone, such as Duran, can quite literally change the environment around them in a temporary or very permanent manner. And when we get to Duran, you'll see exactly what I mean by that. Duran utilizes almost all four of these magic types. I will say that. The majority of the Calamities usually don't use all four of them. They will use one or two on occasion. Duran pretty much always uses all four. The third type is unlocked when you become an Archmage, and this is considered to be the second highest rank within the order of mages. Again, if I'm remembering things correctly. Beyond that is the Archmagnus. When you become an Archmage, you gain access to something known as Limit Break. Now, I feel like for anybody who is into fantasy, I don't need to really explain what a Limit Break is, but for anybody who isn't aware of what it is, when we talked about magic, we had talked about soft and hard limiters. Basically, a soft limit is a slowed progression. You know, your body is only capable of handling so much at any given point. So you have to build up your power, kind of like in Dragon Ball Z, how all of a sudden they just hit a wall, they hit a ceiling, and they can't get stronger than that until they find out that for some fucking weird reason, if they come back from a near-death experience, they just get a huge boost in power. That's them breaking past their soft limit. The purpose of a soft limit is to slow down the progression and allow your body to acclimate to the amount of power that you're slowly building up more and more and more as time goes on, as you become more and more proficient with your magic. For some people, they may not even have soft limiters. They may only have what is known as a hard limiter. A hard limiter is the absolute maximum that your body is capable of withstanding. And if you were to go beyond that, the consequences are unimaginable. For example, I'd use the analogy that if you primarily use physical strength and you go beyond your hard limiter, you could theoretically throw a simple punch, and upon contact, every single bone in your fist just turns into dust. The flesh of your fist quite literally just explodes all the way down to the wrist. You know, because you've gone beyond what your body can handle. You've gone beyond the absolute limit that your body can withstand without taking damage. And that's what a hard limit is. Some people are born with hard limits basically right off the bat. They'll never be able to grow. Whereas some other people, like Duran and the rest of the Calamities, seemingly have no hard limiter. They're just capable of continuing to go farther and farther and farther and reach levels that no mortal should have ever been able to accomplish. Now, interestingly enough, mages and scientists that study magic have noticed a unique correlation between this seemingly non-existent hard limiter and the presence of unique magics. The majority of the certain Calamities possess a unique magic. And as a result, they've noticed this correlation that almost every single one of them possesses a unique type of magic. And as a result, they're capable of achieving these impossible feats. Maybe there's something going on there. But so, what Limit Break does, and there's two different versions of Limit Break. Interestingly enough, neither of them have a different name. What it does is it allows you to temporarily blow past your current limit, whether that be a soft limit or even a hard limit. It allows you to blow past it for a short amount of time in a very safe manner. Thus meaning that if you're at your hard limit, this is the absolute maximum that you can output, you have access to limit break, you could go beyond that hard limit without risk of injuring yourself, but it's only for a short time. Furthermore, one of the problems with limit break, and one of the reasons why Duran usually doesn't use it, is because after you come down from that quote-unquote high of the limit break, it's debilitating. The exhaustion in your body is just unfathomable. It's like, imagine maybe not even working. Imagine the people who do the like, how long can I stay awake for challenges, you know? Like the people who stay awake for like 2 days straight without falling asleep, the sheer level of exhaustion that they have, or even like you go to the gym and you go way too hard at the gym, you know, to the point where it's like everything hurts in the moment and you just feel so sluggish and like you're afraid you can't even make it to the chair that is like 10 feet away from you without falling down. It is completely debilitating. And this is just when it comes to physical. When we're talking about magical, you're on the very edge of gaining mana deprivation. And we've talked about this before. Mana deprivation is I don't want to say a disease, it's more of like a consequence of using too much magic. You know, you start to gain symptoms of vertigo, and then that goes further to the point where you become short of breath, your body becomes weak, your consciousness, you know, you're not quite unconscious, but everything is like a hazy, syrupy, you know, it's like everything is coated in molasses, you know, and this can go all the way out to actual organ failure and death as a result of just spending too much time in mana deprivation. Now, how do you get out of mana deprivation? Don't use magic. It's as simple as that. For some people, that's really hard, especially individuals who constantly use magic without realizing it. There are certain individuals who completely unconsciously boost their own physical capabilities well beyond what is considered normal for mortals. And as a result, when they unleash massive amounts of spells, they will very, very quickly enter mana deprivation. And in these types of situations, in these types of cases, they need things like various different potions, elixirs, or even energy drinks. Like, they could just slam a monster energy drink or something. And basically, it's anything to raise that mana, because their body, even though they're entering mana deprivation, their body is so used to just unconsciously using that magic to strengthen the body, it'll continue to do it to the point of death. Alright, now for the final type of magic. And this one is usually reserved for individuals who are officially seen as Archmagnus. And it's not necessarily seen by the Council of Mages. You are now an Archmagnus, because in order for somebody to be officially recognized as an Archmagnus, they have to be a Siritan Calamity. That they basically made that rule. Like, the Calamities are so fucking insane and nobody comes close to them. If you want to be an Archmagnus, you have to be accepted within the Calamities. Annoying, but whatever. It's known as magic activation. Now, we had talked about something very, very similar in the last episode, and we talked about mana activation. Mana activation is when your magic activates. You gain access to it the very first time. This is what we were talking about with Valeria, how her magic became accessible to her very late in life, whereas considered that to some other people, or compare that to some other people who their magic may become accessible at birth, and that is known as mana activation. Magic activation, however, is something significantly different and way more powerful. Magic activation is most notably seen within the irises in the eye. When magic activation occurs, the individual will blink, and when they open their eyes, their eye color of the iris will shift to whatever element their magic is. So as a result, when, let's say, Valeria was to do a magic activation, which she can't, but let's say that she could for just a second, her irises would all of a sudden look like explosions. Not like an actual, like, mushroom cloud design in her eyes, but it would be the colors of explosions, red, orange, maybe a little bit of black in there, maybe a little gray for the ash, it would look like an explosion. Not an actual detailed image of an explosion, but the colors would be reminiscent of an explosion. Duran's, on the other hand, would look like fucking molten magma. Isaiah's is pure stark white, let's see, who's some other ones? We have Raymond, whose eye color is pitch black, like literally abyssal black with little specks of white in there, kind of like the void of space, black space with all of the stars in the background, And what this does is it basically allows a massive explosion of magic to occur. Not like an actual, like, explosion in the real world, but like their magical capabilities just explode. And all of a sudden, when they do this, they are capable of sometimes increasing the magnitude of their spells by upwards of thousands of times, sometimes even tens of thousands of times more powerful than they were just a moment ago. And the crazy thing about this is that although it requires absolutely ridiculous amounts of control over the magic, there's basically no downside whatsoever. And as a result, it's very rare for a Calamity to use this. It has to be a really, really, really bad situation to necessitate a Calamity to use magic activation. With that in mind, let's kind of talk about the way that Calamities get into the battlefield. Because there are two different ways that Calamities will actually fight. 99% of the time when a Calamity appears in any conflict, it's simply because they were nearby. They were floating around in space, somebody shot a distress signal at them, and they were like, fuck it, I got nothing better to do, and just piss off to the planet and then just start wrecking house. In these types of situations, which again is 99% of the time, they fight as natural disasters. Their magical spells still have the same yield as normal, but, it's not world-ending level spells left, right, and center. It's more putting massive craters in the battlefield nonstop. Like fighting at the magical level of a natural disaster, but fighting at the spellcasting frequency of a Calamity. And as a result, it's basically like, especially for Duran and Raymond, they both have rapid fire spells that are very easy for them to cast. They don't require any attention on them whatsoever. They can basically just activate the spell and just be like, keep it on a loop and just bam, 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 bam. Like, it's literally like machine gun fire from these spells. And as a result, the spells themselves, they may not be super powerful, but goddamn do they saturate the entire battlefield. And as a result, at that point, it doesn't matter if they're on the level of a natural disaster. That is going to fuck some shit up fast. And that's exactly the point. It is exceptionally rare that a Calamity will request their power bracelets to be removed. And I realize now that I kind of glanced over that. When a Calamity is set onto the battlefield, like properly, like they get an order from the Siritan Emperor or the Siritan Supreme Commander, which, fun fact, although they directly respond to the orders of the Supreme Commander, it's like a 50-50 shot on whether or not they'll actually listen to the guy. And that may sound wild, especially to people that are in the military. You would disregard the orders of your commanding officer? What? You have to remember that these guys are essentially the equivalent of a nuclear bomb. If he doesn't want to fucking do something, there's not a damn thing you can do to make him change his mind. Like, what's the worst that you could do against a calamity? You know, you can't remove their immortality, which if their immortality was removed, they would instantly turn to dust. You know, you can't remove their immortality. Most of them you can't even fucking hurt, no matter what you're using, even antimatter weaponry. You know, something like the spinal weapon of a mega carrier being shot at them, they probably have spells that can hold it off, like fucking Harry Potter and Voldemort in their little fucking magic stream duel thing that they had there in that one movie. You know, there's not really a whole hell of a lot that can actually make a calamity do what they're told. Now, that being said, if it's an order that comes from the Emperor, it doesn't matter how fucking obstinate they are, they will listen to that order and they will do it instantly. But basically, the root of the story is that when a calamity goes onto the battlefield and it's an actual legitimate order, you need to go here and you need to solve this situation, they're usually war zones that are the most apocalyptic situation that you can imagine. Like, think about that for a second. Imagine a battlefield that is the most apocalyptic situation you can possibly imagine. Now spike it with so much steroids that it would kill a god. And that's the type of shit that calamities are sent on. You know, these are battlefields that will determine the fate of the Siritan Empire as a whole. That's where these guys are deployed. And when they are deployed, nothing is being held back. They still have their power bracelets, and they're fighting with everything they got. But when a calamity requests the removal of a power bracelet, it is given heavy scrutiny on whether or not this calamity actually requires this much power. Because again, if you give them too much power, they may end up just nuking reality. The problem is that while this is a fantastic system, there are 3 calamities that they don't really give a shit, and they can actually just destroy the power bracelets. What exactly the power bracelets are made of is unknown, but they're practically indestructible. Like, its durability goes beyond even Solstite. Nobody knows what the hell it is. And it is only Siritan Calamity Yandril, Siritan Calamity Raymond Ulcia, and Siritan Calamity Duran that can just outright just take it in their hands and just fucking break them. Because Yandril has more strength than even his own father knows. Raymond can quite literally just turn it into a diamond with the click of his fingers because he has gravity, and Duran will quite literally just melt the shit off his arms. Now, that being said, they only do this when they're either really put into the corner or really pissed off. And I'll say this, it's not easy to piss off a calamity. It's very hard to piss off a calamity, but if you manage to do one, they're not going to hold anything back. They will break those power bracelets and they will fuck your shit. Just because they can, because you pissed them off. Now, the final thing that we need to cover before we get to our Calamity deep dive is something known as dual casting and double casting. These are 2 very important concepts within Magic, and despite the similarity in their names, they have completely different purposes. First, we'll cover dual casting. Think the anime Fairy Tail and what the hell was it called? I think it's called a unison raid. I think that's what it's called when, what the hell are their names? It's been so long since I watched Fairy Tail. Gray and, what the fuck is the chick's name? Julia, I think. When they were in Magnolia and they did that weird, like, ice-water attack, I think they called it a unison raid. It's basically 2 mages will get together and they will combine their magic spells together, like their 2 most powerful spells together, and combine them together into an even more powerful variant. It's a very common trope within magic systems. But it'll take the power of both spells, it'll combine them together, and then the power of that combined spell is then spiked by several times. You know, it's not the this spell does has this amount of power, this spell has this amount of power. You combine them together and just add the numbers, and that's how powerful it is. No, it's you add those numbers and then you magnify it by like 5 times, and then that's the power you have. They're incredibly powerful, but they're incredibly taxing to the caster. Now, a double cast is when a singular mage is firing multiple spells at the exact same time. Now, for 99% of mages, doing even just a double cast is very difficult. That being said, there are mages who can do something similar to a double cast. And that is basically mages who can activate magical sequences or magical spells at an incredibly rapid rate. So then basically it's like a machine gun. The spells aren't activating at the same time. It's more like activate, really close together to the point where it almost looks like you're casting them simultaneously, but you're not. Now, actually, within Magic, this is considered to be smarter to do. Whereas things like double casting, triple casting, quadruple casting, 5 cast, 6 cast, 7 cast, 20 cast, 100 cast, these are considered to be, whilst very powerful, also very stupid. Because what it does is when you're double, triple casting, 4 cast, 5 cast, whatever it is you may be doing, when you do this, it takes the power of those normal spells and it just increases their power a bit. But it basically doubles the amount of mana that the spells are required. So as a result, rather than doing double casting, a lot of mages will just do sequence casting, doing it really fast, because then the spell still costs the same amount of mana, but it doesn't get that damage buff, And it's like, the damage buff is certainly useful, but it's not always necessarily a be-all, end-all kind of situation. Once again, unless you're a Calamity, at which point Calamities are around for so long, and no matter which of the Calamities we're talking about, each of them is fascinated by the way that they fight. Alex and Yandril are, and to an extent, Benimaru, are fascinated with physical strength. So as a result, Alex and Yandril, they'll constantly try and find new ways to just make themselves stronger. Whereas someone like Benimaru, he'll constantly try to find new ways to make his techniques with his blades just that little bit sharper, just that little bit finer, refine that technique, increase that strength. Whereas with a lot of the other Calamities, it's magic focused. And as a result, they much more prefer to focus on finding various different ways, that looks like an eye, finding various different ways to, sharpen their spells, find new ways to make the spell more efficient, or find a way to increase the power without overly increasing the mana cost, all of these different ways of just modifying and optimizing their spells. So as a result, when you get to Calamities, oftentimes they've optimized their spells to such an extreme amount that they can do like a 4 cast, a 4 cast or a 5 cast or a 6 cast without any extra mana requirements. And the amount of damage boost that they get from that, say, 7 cast is very much larger. It's way higher. Okay. I'm going to take a break here just for a quick second. It's going to be just literally the blink of an eye for you guys, but it's going to be maybe 5-10 minutes for me. I'm going to pause the recording, and then we will be right back. And we're back. So, it is now time for us to talk about our Ciritan Calamity deep dive. I've been looking forward to this one for a very, very long time, because I keep on hyping them up. So you guys may have figured it out already. Today, we are talking about Duran Bosmer, his official deep dive. So, first and foremost, we need to understand Duran's backstory. And this is largely where the majority of the episode is honestly going to be. So, Duran's backstory. We don't have a lot of information about Duran's backstory. The Syrvitan Empire used to have a lot of information, but at some point they suffered a massive data corruption situation that, for whatever incredibly coincidental and bizarre reason, completely obliterated all backstory on Duran. So pretty much everything that we have is purely from Duran's own mouth. And whilst we have confirmed that it wasn't Duran who perpetrated this quote-unquote system purge, still relatively interesting that all that data was corrupted, and now suddenly there's no information on Duran's backstory. So our story begins on an unidentified planet, in an unidentified region of space, in an unidentified universe, in an unidentified multiverse. Basically, we have no fucking clue where this planet was. This was Duran's birth world, his home world. And on this planet existed multiple different kingdoms. They largely existed within the medieval to Renaissance era. There were multiple kingdoms. The majority of them, whilst certainly powerful, had nothing on the most powerful kingdom, simply known as Arcadia. And Arcadia was largely a pacifistic kingdom. They would fight if necessary, but they usually wouldn't involve themselves in wars and oftentimes preferred to talk things out diplomatically rather than sparking a massive war and wasting not only resources but soldiers on such trivial matters as they saw it. Well, it turns out that despite the fact that they were essentially Switzerland, completely neutral, this didn't really vibe well with the rest of the kingdoms, and they were constantly worried that the absolute powerhouse that was Arcadia would eventually try to take all of their resources, all of their land, so on and so forth. The concerns of petty kingdoms, shall we say. Well, it turns out that there was some other faction that was none too pleased with the power that Arcadia held, for whatever reason. And this was 5 gods. Now, it's been long questioned why exactly these gods were so invested in the fate of this world, let alone the downfall of the Kingdom of Arcadia, and unfortunately there's never really been any answers, even though one of those gods is still around. There's still no answers as to why they got involved, but needless to say, they did. Now, we've talked about what happens when a mortal tries to go up against a god. They may be able to harm the god, if they can even do that much, but they'll never be able to kill a god, and this is due to the laws of incomplete immortality. But regardless, we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Arcadian Kingdom's war, quite literally a world war, the entire world against them, lasted for a good 50 years. The war raged on, and little by little the Arcadian kingdom lost ground, but this was largely inconsequential. They had been through these types of situations before and were weathering the storm. Well, it turns out that the gods were none too pleased with this idea, and one god in specific had intervened, time and time again, coming to the land of mortals, walking upon the same ground, and destroying everything that stood in his way. The other kingdoms immediately caught on, realizing that this god, for whatever reason, had become their benefactor, and decided that they weren't going to get in his way whatsoever. As a result, the Arcadian kingdom lost more and more and more ground, until they were finally outside of their final citadel, their capital city. Now, this is where the majority of the information that we have from Duran comes from. He has provided almost no information about the war before this specific event, and it should be noted that the capital city stood for, as Duran puts it, roughly around 4 months. We're not exactly sure what he means by 4 months. I mean, we know how long 4 months is, but we don't know the chronological timeline of this planet, meaning we don't know how long a single day lasts. So as a result, 4 months on this planet compared to Earth could be 2 years, or could be maybe 4 weeks. you know? We have no idea how long the day-night cycle lasts or anything like that, how long a year is, That's why it's a bit difficult for us to fully understand. We know that it was 50 years, but we don't know if that's 50 years in terms of the widely accepted galactic time scale, if that is based off of the planet's time scale, or if that's based off of more of like an Earth time scale. We have no idea. But regardless, it lasted for 2 months, or 4 months, outside of the walls of the capital city. And the Arcadian kingdom, whilst possessing almost no resources or manpower left, were capable of holding that line again for that 4 months, until one fateful day the gods appeared. Now, they started off as simply just observing for a few days, until finally one of the gods decided to once again become a bit more proactive, and came to the ground, and within an instant, faster than the guards on the walls could even perceive, he dashed forward and simply punched the gate, and the gate exploded inward, destroying many, many houses on the other side. As a result of this massive explosion near one of the gates, the Arcadian kingdom immediately rallied all of his forces. He told the city guards, or at least as many as he could spare, to round up every single civilian that he possibly could and take them inside of the castle. The castle itself was built into a mountain. As a result, it was only the west, south, and east sides that could realistically be assaulted. Furthermore, directly in front of the castle was the city's main plaza. This was separated by a massive moat, so realistically nobody could get to the other side without specialist equipment. As a result, the only access point to the castle grounds, and thus the castle, was a single bridge. This is where the Arcadian king stood. He immediately told any forces that he could spare to immediately go towards the eastern wall that had just been breached, but he was wise. He also sent a small portion to the southern and western gates to ensure that they remained strong, as he wasn't exactly sure what had happened. He even sent his own personal honor guard, despite their reservations about leaving their kings aside. They wished to fight by his side to the bitter end, but he sent them ahead to try and hold the line at the gate. Now, if you haven't already figured this out, the Arcadian king is Duran himself. This is back during a time when Duran simply didn't have the sheer levels of insane magic that he does now. Whilst he certainly did have powerful fire magic at the time, he certainly didn't have access to his Molten magic yet. He was a very late bloomer, shall we say, when it came to his mana activating. Nevertheless, he stood at the central plaza, and eventually the western and southern gates were overwhelmed, but not before a massive flood of enemies had come through from the east, and at that point he knew what had happened. The city guards, as well as his ever-faithful honor guard, had fallen. He could see off in the distance, on the walls, soldiers still fought a desperate, losing battle against the enemies, very quickly being overwhelmed. Soon the entire armies of the enemies would be at his feet. Luckily for Duran's people, Duran was not going to go down without a fight, and unleashed quite literal hellish firestorms across the entire city plaza, incinerating any enemy that would dare get too close. Eventually, he started to notice that the enemies started to trickle in. Instead of massive hordes of soldiers in bright, gleaming armor, suddenly it was just a few soldiers dotted here and there that were dealt with very weak spells, as they simply just couldn't withstand his fury. Soon, though, Duran found out why they had started to trickle in. When a god comes onto the battlefield, there is a sensation that mortals are capable of tuning into. A sort of aching at the back of the mind. such as something primordial, all-powerful, something that should be worshipped at all costs, is approaching you. And for the majority of mortal beings, when a god approaches, it almost unconsciously forces them down to their knees in a sign of obeisance. Luckily, Duran wasn't really affected by this, but he could certainly sense and knew what was coming. One of the gods was approaching. Now, in all fairness to Duran, he gave him one hell of a fight and did significant damage to the god. But as we know about the laws of immortality, Duran never had a chance of killing the god, as whether it be directly or indirectly, Duran cannot kill the god, as he himself is not a god. In the very final moments of the battle, which lasted for no more than less than 5 minutes, the god shot forward again at that impossible-to-perceive speed and ran his hand and arm directly through Duran's chest, directly where his heart was, instantly obliterating his heart. Now, obviously, this seems like a really bad situation, and it sounds like Duran is going to die, but we know that Duran is still around, so how the hell does he squirm his way out of this? Well, nobody's exactly sure how the hell he did it. Nobody's exactly sure how he did what he did. But we know what he did. We just don't understand how he did what he did. In the very final moments, right as his life was draining from him, right as the darkness was encroaching into his vision and his entire body was going cold, he felt this overwhelming heat, as if he had been plunged into the sun itself, spreading out across his entire body. Interestingly enough, originating from the wound in his chest, where his heart should be, right where the god's arm was currently shoved firmly into his chest. Now, Duran can't say if this indescribable heat came from the god or simply just his magic finally evolving. What we do know is that the results were damn near apocalyptic. Within an instant, the entire battlefield was engulfed in a blazing fire and heat that rivaled the blaze of the sun itself. The gods that stood back in the background, the 4 remaining ones, immediately noticed this and turned their heads. Suddenly, they felt something that should be impossible. When a god is heavily injured, they radiate an energy. This specific energy informs other gods that there is one that is injured nearby, and they may require assistance, whether that be some form of healing or simply just reinforcements. However, when this specific energy, which again can only be felt by gods, is felt on an incredibly massive burst, it means only one thing. Somehow, the god that had gone to go and engage the king of Arcadia had died. Now, it should be noted that there's one interesting little fact about the law of incomplete immortality, and that is this. You can't kill the god, but you can kill its body. Gods are capable of persisting outside of their body via their soul. So as a result, even if you manage to do enough damage to where the body itself dies, all function in the body dies, the soul will still remain. And this is usually when they start to feel that energy, that the god has been seriously injured, they may require healing or reinforcements or whatever. But this burst of energy only happens when the soul of a god is destroyed, when a god actually dies. 3 of the 4 gods immediately ran to see what was going on. When they arrived, the scene was, quite literally, as I said, apocalyptic. The square was unrecognizable. Buildings at the very edge of the square had appeared to be melted, turning into molten rock and obsidian. The fountain at the middle of the square had been completely and utterly vaporized. The stone tiles of the square itself had been rendered into pure glass, and the moat that surrounded the castle had been completely and utterly evaporated. It was quite literally a hellscape, and there in the center of it all stood Duran. The god was nowhere to be seen, completely and utterly vaporized in an instant. How is this possible? How can a mortal kill a god? It's impossible. The laws of immortality forbid it. Yet somehow, this mortal had just killed a god. Such a thing is an impossibility, an affront to them, and there is only one response to such a thing. Destroy it. No matter the cost, destroy this abomination. As a result, the three remaining gods, the three gods that had responded, immediately launched themselves at Duran. Duran, within a fraction of an instant, unleashed torrents of fire that had felt hotter than even the cores of stars, the gods instantaneously dying on contact. Once again, this was not the death of their bodies, but the death of their souls. 4 gods stood, Four gods were dead in the square, caused by Duran, a mortal. Such a thing should be a complete and utter impossibility. Finally, the 5th god approached. Duran immediately readied himself for combat. He didn't understand this new power that he had, but he knew that he could kill gods, and for now, that was enough. However, bizarrely enough, the 5th god didn't look like he was there to avenge his fallen comrades. In fact, there was no malice whatsoever, no hostility. The god simply just approached, calmly. This, needless to say, unnerved Duran. That is, until the god spoke. You are an enigma. I don't understand you, but I understand what you're capable of. And for me, that is enough. Come. I am building an empire of impossible power, one that will rival the very stars themselves, and I require great champions such as yourself. Look behind you. Your castle is destroyed, the people inside most likely dead. You are the king of a dead land. A king cannot rule without his people. Join me, and I shall take you into the stars. Needless to say, Duran was a bit suspicious about all this, until he actually did turn around and notice exactly what the god said was true. The entrance and almost the entirety of the castle's front face had collapsed, and he had believed that the tunnels within the mountain had probably collapsed as well. So fierce was the conflict between himself and the 4 gods. As a result, he accepted, going with this 5th god off into the stars. Now, for any of you who may be a little bit more astute than others, you may realize who this god actually was, as there's a few things that we had that he had said. Specifically, that he was building an empire, one that would rival the stars themselves, and that he would need a champion. Well, this all sounds very much like the Siritan Empire, as we're all well aware. They are an empire, obviously, and they rival the stars themselves. There's almost no faction that can stand against them, and Duran is, I would at the very least call him a champion. This 5th god was none other than the legendary Jackson. Why exactly he was there is unknown, let alone why he didn't engage Duran when the other gods had fallen. Did he have any sort of meaningful connection with these gods? Hell, did the other gods even know who he was? We don't know the answers to that. Legend isn't around to give them, and Duran just seemingly doesn't know them. That is Duran's backstory. And obviously there's a whole lot more information, such as his entire near infinite lifespan that he's possessed up until that point to the current day, but that's largely not important. We're now going to go on to the next topic, and this is the immediate aftermath of this great battle. Duran has left with legend, and the ruins of Arcadia are slowly smoldering. The enemy armies withdraw, but of course this isn't their story. 4 gods remain dead on the planet. But most interestingly enough is the fact that the underground tunnels within the castle didn't actually collapse, and a fair portion of the population of the city still survived. Not anywhere near what it was before the Great War, but nevertheless a substantial amount, including a few of the honor guard and city guards that had escorted them into the castle itself. Over the course of a few months, they finally managed to dig their way out, and what they beheld was an apocalyptic wasteland. The citizens that emerged don't know what happened. When they had gone into the castle, whilst it was certainly war-ravaged, the planet itself was still largely lush and vibrant with life. Yet, after 4 months, the planet had turned into what can best be described as a nuclear wasteland, without nuclear weapons being involved. No radiation, obviously, but completely and utterly barren. No life could grow, no life could survive within this hellscape. They have no clue what happened. Perhaps it was the apocalyptic events that occurred. Perhaps it was a result of the death of 4 gods. We may never know. What we do know is that the unique nature of the planet allowed for land masses that make no sense, such as floating islands in the sky, and even structures that are capable of being created that defy every single form of the laws of physics, such as load-bearing walls being held up by support pillars the size and width of the hair on your head. The nature of this planet was utterly bizarre. However, they had managed to find a way to get onto one of the floating islands far up into the sky. It was one of the largest ones on the planet, and luckily enough, it had survived the apocalypse that had occurred. It was lush, vibrant, but its size was limited. As many people were brought up to the island, but unfortunately they naturally had to cull people in order to keep a safe, healthy population. Now, within the timeline of Shattered Legacies, what happens next is a bit bizarre. We have a quite literal infinite amount of time that passes outside of the planet, but on the planet, nothing more than maybe 20 years go by. Duran finally makes it back to his homeworld, and he's astonished at what he finds. Not only is the planet completely ravaged, but the planet is still in one piece. For some reason, Duran had believed that the planet had long since been destroyed. Perhaps this was some sort of involvement by the Siritan Empire. Perhaps Duran's attempt at some sort of retribution for what had occurred to his kingdom. We may never know. What we do know is that the planet possesses powerful technology on it in the form of a realitorial anchor zone, and the Siritan Empire very much wants to investigate what exactly is on it. Keep in mind that this is so far into the future that not only have damn near 32 Siritan Empires risen and fallen, 32 realities have been created and destroyed. But the Siritan Empire has gone through a number of different collapses, including the Ruin War and the most recent collapse known as the Demon Legion's Crusade. Now, we'll get to the Demon Legion's Crusade in a bit, as this is the newest lore for Shattered Legacies. This isn't information that has been made available in the deep dives that we've done so far, but we will get to it eventually. The majority of lore that we're going to be looking at for a very long time is post-Ruin War, whereas there will be new information coming out very slowly over time about this brand new event known as the Demon Legion's Crusade, which caused yet another collapse of the Siritan Empire, but that's not important. What is important is that this information is of the newest lore, i.e. it is post-Demon Legion Crusade, rather than post-Ruin War. Duran gets to the world, and they immediately want to investigate this realitorial anchor zone. It may possess technology that is incredibly important to them and may give them an edge in this new hellscape that they find themselves in, which seems to be apropos for the majority of Shattered Legacies. Upon getting near the island that they believe possesses this realitorial anchor, they immediately come under fire. Fireballs of unusual power are sent flying through the air. Multiple shuttles are shot down, engulfed in a blazing fire, and a few manage to get out alive. They immediately report what they had found. Well, lo and behold, Duran just so happens to be in charge of this little exploration fleet that he himself had created. Possibly not with the approval of the Siritan royal family. He immediately gets into one shuttle, and the singular shuttle is sent at the island. Fireballs are immediately unleashed, and Duran immediately creates a molten shield to protect them, deflecting every single fireball and even moving the shield as is needed to protect the shuttle. He then notices a woman standing on the edge of the island, letting loose all of these spells, and he's rather impressed at the total quality of these spells. After all, they're on the level of a natural disaster, borderline calamity candidate if he had to guess. Needless to say, though, they manage to finally land, and it's only when they get close to landing that the fireballs stop, presumably to prevent any damage coming to the island itself. Needless to say, though, when the doors of the shuttle open up, much weaker fireballs are immediately shot forward at the opening, Duran immediately preventing them from hitting. He tells everybody in the shuttle to stay in the shuttle and take off immediately. He was going to deal with this personally. The shuttle immediately takes off, protected by Duran once more. This woman, once again, appears to be an incredibly highly powerful mage. At the very least, most likely a master, maybe even a grandmaster. However, she is nothing but a newborn child when compared to Duran's capabilities. Duran used a single spell that decided the battle in an instant. It is a spell known as Molten World, which immediately causes his trait, known as Thermal Spike, which naturally increases the ambient temperature around him, to explode outwards in every single direction, immediately and instantaneously immolating a massive region of the island. The woman immediately steps back in utter horror. She's facing something that is equivalent to a god. To be able to instantaneously immolate a massive portion of the island, ironically enough, not even touching the part that the civilians were on, and seemingly with no effort whatsoever, she had to be facing a god. But she knew that she had to defend these people, and thus unleashed holy hell upon the god-like being. Duran, not giving two single shits about the situation, simply just stood there, in the middle of a quite literal miniature ocean of magma. The woman continued to fire spell after spell after spell of increasing creativity and power at Duran, yet nothing even came close to affecting him, let alone touching him. Eventually she ran out of gas, and he slowly started to stride towards her until he was directly in front of her. The entire time, neither of them are aware of each other's identities, as these two individuals do actually know one another. This entire time, due to the fact that there is smoke covering everything, largely because of Duran immolating everything, but also due to the high-yield fire spells that have been launched everywhere, burning everything around them. Eventually the smoke clears, and Duran can't believe his eyes. This is an impossibility. This person shouldn't still be alive. The woman is still glaring at him with utter hatred in his eyes until he utters one word. April. She immediately stops. How does this godlike being know her name? Well, if he's really a god, I suppose it shouldn't be that surprising that a god would know her name. Then she actually looks at him, and although he has changed indescribably over the years, almost to the point where it seems like an infinite amount of time has passed for him compared to her, she recognized him. Her older brother, Duran. The two immediately embrace one another. They haven't seen each other, well, for April, in quite a few years. Or quite a few months. I forget which one I said. For Duran, it's been an infinite number of lifetimes. He doesn't understand how April's alive, but he knows one thing for a fact above all else. This is his younger sister, April Bosphorus. The two get to talking, and he starts to realize little bits and pieces and slowly builds the story of how she's alive. Then he realizes it. The island itself is a realitorial anchor zone. And this one in specific, whilst most likely not possessing any incredibly advanced technology, has dilated time so immensely that everything outside of the island appears to be going by at light speed. Time itself going by at light speed. As a result, only a few months have passed on the island, yet an infinite number of lifetimes have passed on the outside. This is why, I'm actually remembering it was 20 years. This is why she only looks 20 years older. And most importantly, why she's not dead. She was one of the very few people who had managed to make it within the castle before all hell broke loose and the enemy armies flooded through. Many civilians hadn't made it to the castle in time. They continue to talk, and eventually April takes him to the entire population. They are immediately fearful as they saw what just went down, their greatest warrior having been so soundly defeated by what, again, could only be described as a god, which, to be fair, is essentially what Duran is at this point. However, April explains the situation, and explains that despite the fact that he looks nothing like the man they once knew, this was their king. This is King Duran, king of Arcadia. They immediately rejoice. Their king has returned, yet his power is indescribable, and his age is unfathomable. Yet, that doesn't seem to affect any of them. Duran understands the situation, and he theorizes that not only due to the conflict that just occurred, but also just due to the natural state of this planet and the subtle effects of the realitorial anchor zone on the planet, that is most likely nearing its end of days, which is one of the reasons why they came to this one, and this realitorial anchor zone in specific, as they believed that soon it would be destroyed. He immediately gave the situation. They can't stay here, but he promises them that he can take them somewhere that is far better. Somewhere that they can live with incredible, lavish lives. They can live in prosperity and not have to settle for the confines of a small, dwindling island. They immediately accept, although April is a bit dubious. She doesn't understand where her brother has been. It's only been 20 years, yet he looks like he has the wisdom of a man who's lived 20... He looks like a man who has the wisdom of an individual who has the... Jesus Christ. Moving on. He basically looks like he has wisdom well beyond his life. He explains the situation. He explains that time doesn't flow the way that it's supposed to here, and that on the outside, an infinite amount of time has passed. He says that she doesn't have to understand it, and in fact, she may never understand it. She just has to trust him. She immediately says that she trusts him to no end. He was a good king, and she believes that he will continue to be a good king. And so, the two, with the entire population of the Arcadian kingdom at this point, get on to shuttles that are coming down to the island and take off into the stars. Many of them are very cautious and confused as to why they're going into the sky. Surely they can't be invited into the realm of gods, can they? Until they realize that this isn't the realm of gods. This is an inhospitable void that exists right outside of their small world, and they're going onto ships that will sail this void and the stars themselves. As a result, the two eventually continue to bond with one another. April trusts her brother far more than ever before, and Duran tries to convey as much information as possible. Due to the unique situation between him and April, Duran is granted the ability, he's given permission to grant her the ability of their immortality, and thus grants April biological immortality for Calamity. Little does anybody know that she is very quickly and soon to become a certain Calamity candidate, as her power is astronomical. Now, we're not going to go any further into April. As a matter of fact, that's about as far as we're going to go in general. Eventually, April will have her own deep dive, but the reason that we're not doing it, especially anytime soon, is due to the fact that all of this information is literally brand new. Like, within the last couple of months, I have been crafting up all of this different lore. So, there's really not a lot about her right now, and these specific events are very much like, this is modern time, within Shattered Legacies, whereas the majority of stuff that we're talking about is history. So, with all of that out of the way, let's actually go to Duran's abilities. Yes, I know. We're not even done yet. So, Duran is one of the most powerful characters in Shattered Legacies. In fact, there are only roughly 2 or 3 individuals that are actually stronger than him. And we've kind of talked about them. These individuals being Legend, Rex, and Zera. Or Xeris. Zera? Yeah, Zera. We'll talk about the other 3 at a later date, but for right now, we just need to get the idea that Duran is by far one of the most powerful characters. And I'm actually going to be going into why I repeatedly say that it doesn't matter what anime protagonist you throw at Duran, there's nobody that can beat him. Not unless you're throwing a Shattered Legacies character at them, and even then, you require those 3 characters, either Legend, Zera, or Rex, to actually beat Duran. So why is that? Well, as we've talked about multiple times, Duran has the unique effect of the fact that his magic and his trait have combined with one another. And so, they've melded together. And so as a result, he has direct control over his magic and his trait in such a way that would normally be impossible. And as a result, Duran, at all times, directly pressed up against his skin with the width of a hair, has this heat shield all around him. And you can't see it, nor can you see any form of heat haze. But it's there. And its heat is equivalent to, if you were to touch it, you would immediately vaporize your entire body and probably a good portion of the ground at your feet. That's how hot it is. But because of how incredibly thin it is, it doesn't radiate any heat outwards. Not only that, but he's capable of directly setting how far the heat radiates out to, because of course he can. And so as a result, nobody and nothing is capable of touching Duran unless he explicitly wants them to. At which point, if he wants to shake somebody's hand, he literally diverts all of the heat away from his hand. That hair-thin heat shield is still there, but it's at the level of just normal body temperature. His hands will be very warm, but it's not anything like burning. And so as a result, he's impossible to assassinate. It doesn't matter how far out you are, it doesn't matter what weapon you have, you can shoot directly at his head. The second anything, even antimatter, touches that heat shield, it instantly turns into molten material and falls to the ground. At which point Duran then turns around, realizes there's molten material, looks up, and he's like, what in the fuck? Really? We're doing this shit again? This also means that this heat shield is capable of affecting anything. It's capable of affecting kinetic weapons, energy weapons, exotic energies such as antimatter. It's capable of affecting even the influence of psionics. Like, psionics doesn't have a physical form. Like a bullet, an energy round, a spell, they all have some form of physical form. Whereas psionics doesn't. It's just this, it's basically like radio waves. But the second that the psionics comes into contact with that heat shield, it immediately turns into molten material. How in the hell he's turning radio waves equivalent into molten material, I have no idea, but he can do it. And as a result, he can also melt magic. It doesn't matter what spell you throw at him. It doesn't matter how powerful the spell is. You could even throw a nuke at him, and even if the nuke doesn't directly hit him, it hits next to him, the heat shield will literally immolate the explosive, the fire and the heat from the explosion, as well as even the radiation and the fallout material that comes into contact with a heat shield. It will immediately immolate him and render him completely safe. He can even immolate radiation. The dude is untouchable. Now, his most basic spell is known as Molten World, and we just talked about it. Basically, he takes that heat shield that's directly touching his skin, and he fires it out to a specific distance of his choosing at basically light speed. And the terrain all around him just immediately, within less than a nanosecond, less than a heartbeat, less time than it takes to blink your eyes, the entire battlefield is just converted into an ocean of molten material. And the unique thing about Duran's magic as a result of melding with this trait is now the more molten material Duran has access to, the more powerful his spells become to a theoretical infinite level. Duran's second most basic spell is known as Incineration. And it's basically, when we had talked about magic, we had talked about there are multiple different types, and then one of them is known as runic magic. We're specifically talking about how you cast spells. One of them was runic magic. Basically, you spend endless hours crafting a rune, and then you use it once, and it's the most powerful way to cast a spell. Incineration works similar to runic magic, but it's not. It's like this utterly bizarre, self-created casting method that takes silent spell casting and runic casting. It's as fast as silent spell casting. It has the power of runic magic, but it doesn't actually require a rune, despite the fact that when the spell activates, there are clearly runes in the air around him. And what Incinerate does is it fires a, literally like the width of a hair, or maybe the width of a pea. It fires a beam forwards, and no matter what the beam hits, it doesn't affect anything. It's basically like a laser pointer, is what it is. It's showing where the spell is about to hit. So if you have fast enough reflexes, you can theoretically get out of it. But you have literally like a nanosecond. Like, I'm not exaggerating here. You have like a nanosecond from the time that beam goes in a straight line forward to when the spell actually activates. And what happens is it creates a cylindrical explosion of heat around that essentially laser beam looking thing. And it just obliterates anything that it comes into contact with. Now, you may find this rather bizarre, as Duran is already powerful enough as it is. Duran has buff magic. He has different spells that give him buffs. We've talked about one, which is Molten Blood, which basically it strengthens his skin, gives him far higher physical strength, as well as giving a slight regeneration effect sort of thing. Basically, his wounds will regenerate a little bit faster if he can even be injured at that point. Another buff magic that he has is known as Blazing Sun, and it's quite literally when Duran has access to enough molten material. I realize I haven't been changing the slides. When Duran has access to enough molten material, he starts to create a quite literal miniature sun behind him, directly behind him and up in the air, maybe 10 or 12 feet into the air. And basically the entire time there are little, basically, tentacles of molten material that are coming from the ground and weaving themselves into a big orb in the air. And this is Blazing Sun. This isn't what it does, though, the spell itself. This is just preparation, and it takes a decent amount of time to prepare as well. But once it activates, not only does it increase the overall volatility of Duran's spells, but it will periodically fire a burst of heat. Basically like, what's a good analogy? Like, when an explosion occurs, like let's say a grenade or just any large explosion occurs, if you slow down time, you can actually see the explosion, but then you also see this little, like, barely visible, like, dust cloud going out in every single direction. And this is specifically a shock wave. And it's basically very condensed air mixed with dust particles and stuff like that go out in every single direction. Now, I don't know this for a fact. This is information I learned a really long time ago, but I think that's why things like grenades are so powerful. Yes, the explosion of a grenade is dangerous, especially if it's a fragmentation grenade, but it's that shock wave that is actually the dangerous part. And that's why there is a concept on large weaponized vehicles like tanks and stuff. It's known as overpressure. And basically, when the tank cannon fires, it immediately, if you've ever seen a video on it, especially things like mortar tubes as well, dust will all of a sudden shoot out in every single direction away from the firing point. In this case, the cannon, the end of the barrel of the cannon. And this is caused by overpressure. And from what I understand of overpressure, especially on the level of like an M1 Abrams main cannon, it can literally kill a man if they're standing too close to the barrel. Not because they got hit by the shell, just literally the compressed air just erupting in every single direction from that overpressure can kill a man. And that's basically what Blazing Sun does, is it will periodically fire off basically a wave of overpressure in every single direction. But it's not just overpressure, it's hyper hot temperatures. And so as a result, when it hits you, it launches you back, but it basically like literally burns and chars the skin everywhere that the shockwave hit. And as a result, it can literally just burn away or emoliate people on contact. And there's like, the range of this spell is just fucking insane. Then, of course, he has another ability, as if all of this wasn't already enough, although we've only got 3 spells so far. It's known as the Blazing Wyrum, or the Blazing Worm. And basically, it's a Hydra. It's a number of Hydra heads, or serpent heads, made of solid molten material that will slowly rise up behind Duran. And there's no limit to how many heads it is. Usually it's 7 heads in total, but sometimes it can be upwards of 20 or even 30. And basically, these Hydra heads have 2 different attacks, and they're capable of attacking completely independently of Duran. They're either capable of firing in the incineration spell, as if it wasn't already insane enough that Duran can use it already, but it can also fire very hyper-concentrated jets of molten material that basically just work like lasers and just scorch through anything that it touches. So, as if, once again, all of this wasn't enough already, Duran has been refining his magic over an incredibly long time. And there are a lot of different spells that Duran has access to, but a lot of them aren't really noteworthy. One that is noteworthy is known as Arx Incinerata. And Arx Incinerata is literally, he takes the incineration spell and basically like 20 casts it in an instant. And because it's his own unique spell and not actually a 20 cast, the cost of the spell is the same as a normal incineration. It's basically like sequentially firing 20 incinerations at once, you know? There's no increased mana cost. The damage is spiked through the roof, and there's 20 of these things. There can even sometimes be way more, and it's literally, it just makes like, whatever Duran is currently looking at, if you use Arx Incinerata, it's literally just gone. Like, it could be an entire fucking mountain. The mountain's gone. It's just gone. Because it's just so much firepower in just a straight line that nothing can survive it. So yeah, I think I'm going to call the episode here. There's obviously more information about Duran, but we'll kind of cover it as we cover things that involve Duran, mainly because my throat is absolutely ruined. You guys may have noticed, because at the time of recording this will be Tuesday, that yesterday's episode is late, and that is because it is 7:30 right now, because this episode took way longer than I thought it was going to, and my throat is absolutely shot. So I'm not going to record the 7 Days to Die episode until tomorrow when I get off work, and then I will post it as soon as possible. But you guys already know that because you guys will have already have seen it. This is just me explaining that, yeah. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys are looking forward to tomorrow and Friday's new season, or new series. I hope you guys really enjoy that. As well as we are officially off overtime, so we have our Saturday RimWorld live streams and our Sunday night lives. Hope you guys are looking forward to that. And then follow that by next Monday's 7 Days to Die episode. And then right back on Shattered Legacies on next Tuesday. I have no idea what I'm going to talk about. We should probably take a step away from the Certain Empire and talk about one of the other factions, if I'm going to be honest. We've done a lot of certain stuff, and I realize that there are still factions that we really haven't touched. But that's because there's so much lore for the Certain Empire alone. But regardless, I hope you guys enjoyed. I will see you guys later.